The last section we want to look at with time series data is being able to make a prediction. So there are some things that we need to take into account when we do this prediction. We've got to think about the trend pattern, we've got to think about the seasonality pattern, and we've got to think about where we are predicting, whether it's within the data set or beyond it. So let's go back to our sales of sunglasses. Let's just first of all think about how much data is there. So I'm looking across there, and the data starts in 2005, finishes just before 2011, so it really goes to 2010. So there are 5 years worth of data there. So that's one thing we've got to take into account. We've got 5 years worth of data. If I've only got 2 or 3 years of data, I'm going to be a lot more uncertain about what the trend is doing. If I had 20 years of data, I'm going to be a lot more certain. Okay, so the amount of data, the amount of information we have is quite important. We also need to think about how reliable is the trend line. So there's our trend line through the middle that we came up with our prediction, that we drew our line of best fit for. What I want to do now is just show you a graph. When the computer goes away and analyzes the trend line, this is the graph, the actual graph that the computer comes up with. Okay, and you can see we've fitted our blue trend line to that rather than following the data. So overall, it's not a bad trend line. Okay, the moving average trend line, which is what we call it, the black line versus our line of best fit, is actually reasonable. It's not perfect, but it's not bad. If I now look at how reliable is our seasonality, so again, let's look at quarter 1 and our trend line. All of those quarter 1s are above the trend line. Now let's try quarter 2. They're all below the trend line. Quarter 3, the first one's below, the other ones are above or on the trend line, so that's a bit more, not quite as reliable on that one. And quarter 4, all well below the trend line. So in terms of seasonality, there's a lot of consistent pattern going on there. Quarter 1s are always really high, quarter 4s are always really low. So there is some consistency there, which is good. Lastly, think about what time period are we predicting. Are we predicting inside the data or outside the data? So are we trying to predict from between 2005 up to 2010, or are we trying to predict after 2010? So the reason that that's important is if I'm predicting within a period that I know about, I can have a lot more confidence in my answer, a lot more confidence in my prediction. If I'm trying to predict for 2015, that's 5 years beyond the data itself. Our data only goes to 2010. So if we're trying to predict 5 years beyond the data, anything could happen between 2010 and 2015 to change things about sunglasses completely. So the further I'm away from the data I'm predicting, the more and more uncertain I am of my prediction. Within the data, I am more certain than I am beyond it. If I'm just beyond the data, I'm more certain of that than I am if I'm predicting a long way away. So if I was predicting for 2011, I'd be more confident in that than I would be of predicting in 2015. But that being said, I'd be even more confident if I'm predicting within the data I have. So these are the things we've got to consider. How much data there is, how reliable is the trend, how reliable is the seasonality, and what time period are we predicting? Are we inside or outside the trend? So let's look at our sunglasses sales example. We've got 5 years worth of data. The trend line is a reasonable estimate. It's not fantastic, but it's reasonable. The seasonality is pretty constant, okay? Quarter 1, quarter 2, quarter 3, quarter 4, they're all pretty consistent from year to year, consistently above or below or on the trend line. So I'm going to say, if I predict inside my data, so between 2005 and 2010, I'm going to be reasonably confident in my prediction because we've got a reasonable amount of data, it's got an increasing trend, and our seasonality pattern is consistent or a constant pattern. If I'm predicting beyond my data, then I also need to think about, well, how much further away am I? So the further away I am, the more uncertain my prediction is. Even predicting just beyond my data is less certain than if I was predicting within my data. And so there's our prediction.